Happy Friday. Here's this week's PRG Message of the Week. What to do about a week before closing. When working with a buyer, this is what I'll do about a week before closing. I'll reach out to the lender, see if the buyer's clear to close or close to being clear to close. I'll reach out to my buyer and find out what time on our closing date and where works for them for closing. And I'll also set up with them a time for the final walkthrough. When they tell me a time that works for them, I'll convey that to the seller. Other things to be thinking about. So I review the contract and all the paperwork 1 week prior to closing to see if there's a fuel proration that's in the deal and to see what the source of fuel is. And the reason for this is the buyer will need to know to set up electricity in their name effective the day of closing. If it's propane, they'll need to get the propane account in their name effective the day of closing. If it's natural gas, they'll need to switch that over to their name for the day of closing. So also in regards to fuel, we'll need to do a fuel proration, so that will remind me to get that fuel amount a few days prior to closing so I can get that on the settlement statement. It's also good to do your final walkthrough at least a day before closing, because if you show up and there's still items in the home and it doesn't look like the seller's going to be out on time, you can make a contingency plan about what to do. And if you recall a few weeks ago, my top tip was what to do if you're in that situation where you're at the final walkthrough and the seller isn't fully out. Now, if you're on the seller side, you kind of want to do more or less of the same, but from the other side. So about a week before closing, I'll review the contract. I'll reach out to the buyer's lender, who, by the way, I've been reaching out to periodically every, a couple times a week through the process just to make sure things are moving smoothly. But I'll reach out and just see, are we clear to close or when are we looking to be clear to close? I'll also contact the buyer agent. I'm not going to wait for them to contact me. Just because I do that as a buyer agent doesn't mean other buyer agents are going to do that. So I'll reach out and say, hey, when are you guys thinking about doing your final walkthrough and what works for closing for everybody? I've already spoke to the seller. They would like to close at this time at this location. Does that work for the buyer? I'll also make sure to tell my seller not to turn off any utilities prior to closing. It's their responsibility to keep power, water, heat, everything up and running through the closing. I've had it in the past where I've had a seller, they've got the closing date, they're excited, and I was a little bit inexperienced at the time, so I didn't say anything about keeping the power and utilities on. They call, they get it shut down prior to closing. Buyer shows up the final walkthrough. They don't know if the heating system's working or not because the power's off. So it's important not only to have this conversation a week before closing, but also when you're listing and when you're going under contract and throughout. There's a fuel proration. I'll also make a plan with the seller to get a fuel rating and get that calculation for closing. So that's it for the top tip. According to Mortgage News Daily, interest rates are at 6.96 for a 30-year fixed conventional loan and just over 6.5% for FHA and VA. That's all I have for this week, guys. Have a great weekend. We'll see you around.